has also been another week. I think that's the best way to describe it. As we go forward, we will be in Acts 24:1 through 25:12 today, and continue to speak about Paul and the journey he is on. But this time, this journey is very short compared to how it has been. He's going only up the road about 60 miles to Caesarea with some of Rome's finest. He is on his way. The tribune Lysias had sent Paul to Felix, the governor of the region or the province, and to be actually tried for the lawlessness that the Jews had said that he had performed against them, especially the lawlessness in the temple. So Paul is there awaiting trial and waiting for Ananias and all of his cohorts to come and show up and to have their own case, or not their own case, but to continue their case against Paul, but this time in front of the governor of the province instead of just the tribune Lysias that we see there. Recall as we go through the scriptures here and the trial that we're about to read about in front of Felix is the level of tumultuous times that the people are in there in the Roman Empire. It is not a peaceful situation. People talk about, I've brought this up before, Pax Romana. Pax Romana is, of course, Roman peace, but Roman peace was pretty much defined by peace through violence, and that's the way in which these people live. Jews, Gentiles, you name it, they live that way. With that said, during this time period, we're probably in the late 50s AD, late 50s, possibly early 60s. We're there, and away we go, and bad things are happening there in that region. And we're trying to figure out exactly how that is all going to play out. And we will learn in about 12 years how all that's going to play out in 70 AD whenever the temple is destroyed by the Romans. But anyways, we have this insurrection, we've heard that word a lot lately, boiling right below the surface there. And this insurrection is being led by zealot Jews who are not for the Romans nor for the way, which is, of course, what they refer to as Paul's group. Therefore, the true Jewish tradition. So a lot of the Sanhedrin, you could say Ananias, the chief priest, were kind of in the back pocket of the Romans because it's one of those deals where if you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. We'll keep the peace, you keep the peace, we all keep our money, and we all stay powerful. And that was fine for them. It was not fine for those who were not in power, and so they were looking for a way to get rid of Rome. And it led to eventually to this huge revolution. Many people were killed. It was quite a deal that is well beyond the scope of what we're trying to study here. The last thing the Romans needed and the last thing the Jews needed was this guy Paul to be running around and talking about the way, or but the continuation of the Jewish faith with the Messianic Messiah. So all of that was kind of being played in the background as this trial is leading up. So as you can imagine, the situation was already quite tense well before any of this really got going. Another thing to keep in mind is that we're on the eastern front of the Roman Empire, which seems most likely to probably be the least stable region of that area. It is a place where a lot of the grains and a lot of the other foodstuffs were coming from, especially from Egypt, to feed the large, never satiated Roman Empire that continued to grow and continue to grow powerful. And the way it was able to remain growing and staying powerful is by identifying and having control over all the food. And so this was a thing that would put a lot of pressure on Felix, and eventually who we get to know, Festus, and the other governors who are on the eastern side of the frontier. And as you can say, that would add a lot of stress. And we'll learn from Felix that he is not a man of character. He himself is a former slave. We'll get a little bit into that here in a little bit. We also know that he'll do about anything to keep the peace in the area, which could be either killing Jews or appeasing Jews, depending on what would be to his benefit. And the Jews knew this, and so use all of their tools of persuasion to for the most part, to persuade Felix to hand them back over. And they almost work at that, but it doesn't all go as planned. On the other side of it, the Jewish leaders were a bit nervous too, as we've not heard anything about the demise of the temple since chapter 7 with the story of Stephen. And they know in the back of their heads that what is going on with them during that time is not good for their lifestyle. So while the temple is, of course, in the center of the Jewish priests, or especially the high priest and his cohorts, is the center of their life and the center of their existence and the center of their power, knowing that this messianic faith is growing, they know that their power is not. And this, of course, would make them nervous. And people in power, as we learn, as we have witnessed recently, people in power don't like to lose power, especially people without any sort of character or moral compass really don't like to lose power. And it causes a lot of strife and makes them a bit twitchy and defensive and begin speaking against Paul, because Paul is an easy enemy to pick on, and which makes sense. I mean, it's at the end of the day, it's not like a surprise that this is happening, because of the way power structures work and the way people's personalities and characters work and the way we kind of live. And so let's go here and see how this all plays out and see how it goes as we go into chapter 24. We'll start here in verses 1 through 9 to kind of give us a quick intro. We'll make our way through. 24 is a pretty short chapter, and then we'll jump into part of chapter 25. I think we'll go into verse 12. So, away we go. Chapter 24, verses 1 through 9. After 5 days, the high priest Ananias came down with some elders, with an attorney named Tertullus, and they brought charges to the governor against Paul. After Paul had been summoned, Tertullus began to accuse him, saying to the governor, "Since we have through you attained much peace, and since by your providence reforms are being carried out for this nation, we acknowledge this in every way and everywhere, most excellent Felix, with all thankfulness." It's quite an intro, if you know what I mean. "But that I may not weary you any further, I beg you to grant us by your kindness a brief hearing, for we have found this man a real pest, and a fellow who stirs up dissension among all the Jews throughout the world, and the ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes." It's quite a deal. We haven't heard that word in a while. I think we would have a reference idea of what that is for, but that is quite interesting. Brings that up. Anyways, verse 6, "And he even tried to desecrate the temple, and then we arrested him." Aren't they heroes? That's what they're trying to sound like, right? "We wanted to judge him according to our own law, but Lysias, the commander, came along with much violence, took him out of our hands, ordering his accusers to come before you. By examining him yourself concerning all these matters, you will be able to ascertain the things of which we accuse him." The Jews also joined in the attack, asserting that these things were so. Wow. So we're going to learn a whole bunch of new things here. We get reintroduced to Ananias. We get introduced to Felix, and also to a new guy named Tertullus, who we believe is to be a Greek attorney who has kind of his own fun story to tell. And it's also, as you can see, if you went back to some of the other information, what he's saying is not fully true, which is part of the fun of being a barrister there in Rome at that time. And you'll notice here that he kind of gives a very interesting, well, to them it wouldn't be interesting, it'd be a normal introduction and confirmation of who Felix is in a very positive way. So here we go. Paul's accused before Felix by Ananias and the other members of the Sanhedrin, most likely all Sadducees, because if you remember at the end of the last time we talked, the Pharisees were starting to kind of get on Paul's side a little bit. The Sadducees were really the ones who were having, it seems, an issue with Paul. Not to say there weren't any Pharisees with them, but it seems to be that it's probably mainly Ananias and other Sadducees. They seem to have taken the scenic 5-day journey, unlike Paul's what seemed to be a one-night journey or one-day journey to Caesarea. So they took their time to get there. Upon the arrival of Ananias and company, they employ an advocate, the barrister by the name of Tertullus, to represent their case to Felix. A sense of forensic rhetoric is what we get here, because it seems like it is a truly a trial. And they bring in an attorney to do that. Most likely, Tertullus was a Hellenistic Jew. It was his job to advocate as the prosecuting attorney in the Jewish position that they felt that Paul had done to them, to the Roman authorities. So verses 2 and 4, it is believed here they were given a summary of the speech, yet Luke includes the full introduction, showing the significant amount of flattery that Tertullus is giving to Felix. We say this is a summary because most likely speeches like this and other speeches that we've seen from Paul and we're about to see from Paul seem to be summaries that Luke has kind of put together and in order for us to get the gist of what is going on, or the reader the gist of what is going on, but instead of getting the full story. There are other times we will get the full story, but these are kind of just cobbled together so that we can get that get a taste of what is going on here. This idea of flattery given is kind of part of the dance, or the rhetorical dance that was performed a great trial like this. The idea that Felix was someone of great peace, or someone who have kept the great peace, that the people there in Jerusalem enjoy and appreciate his ruling, though we know, if you go back and look at Josephus and other historians who wrote about Felix, he was not really super nice to the Jews, but at this moment they're trying to make the best of it and flatter him. So, like I said, the Pax Romana thing brings back to, and the lack of peace and the kind of the lie that he's saying here about the appreciation that the Jews have for the Romans. You have to remember the Romans would be known to go scorch earth on a community that acted up. And they would then refer to that as a peaceful place. So we have now scorched this place. And at this time, it is now peaceful. And it's mainly because everyone's dead. And those who are still alive are barely making it, or so injured or out of it that they really can't cause any problems anyways. In verse 4, it was customary to promise brevity, even though that wasn't necessarily always true. They would calculate their speeches to stay within a limit and try to read the body language of the governor in order not to upset the governor, but to say enough, but yet not too much. And so it's all well planned out. It was all it was a performance, and that's what they did back then, and that's fine. We do that to this day when you look at trial attorneys and that sort of thing. The reference to the moderation was almost a plea for the governor to be kind to him and the people of Jerusalem, because they knew that he had not in the past. So he does kind of insinuate that this has not always been a peaceful situation, but we're hoping that it will at this time, because it almost feels like it could be. So in verses 5 and 6, after this kind of what we'd refer to as excessive courtesy, Tertullus moves on to the charges against Paul. Many of them, if true, would in fact be punishable, but unfortunately, well, not unfortunately, but fortunately for Paul, they are not. The reference to the pest here that you see there in verse 5, first part of verse 5, is a reference to the treasonous acts of Paul. It is the most sinister of implications to refer to someone as pest. I cannot remember what that word is in Greek at the moment, but it is more than just someone who's kind of getting in the way and causing some inconvenience. It is someone who is really, really causing significant amount of problems and unrest. So you'll see here in his argument, Tertullus moves from the less particular to the more focused and specific charges. Paul here is not only causing uprisings in Jerusalem, but all of the Roman Empire. And Romans, of course, like we said, do not like any type of uprising. So they're bringing that up to say, this guy is causing uprisings. Well, they know what happens when someone causes an uprising. The Romans go squash it. And so he's a ringleader of a dangerous sect. The sect is interesting to hear that they use this, because Sadducees and Pharisees were also referred to as sects. Pretty much all it means is party, like the Sadducee party or the Pharisee party or the Way party or Messianic Jew. So it's interesting that he's using that. He's pretty much putting them in the same box as they're in, but referring to him as, of course, dangerous, which is a little bit different, and Paul is a ringleader of it. Ultimately, the big thing is that Paul has violated the sanctity of the temple, which is similar to actually these 3 points that are brought up are very similar to what was brought up against Jesus. If you go back to Luke 23:2, related to everything that Jesus had done of leading a dangerous sect and defiling the temple and causing problems and uprisings in the area. So we continue on here, and it seems that Paul, according to Tertullus, has habitually stirred up trouble everywhere he went. And the charge that Tertullus brings up is similar to what we saw back in chapter 17, verses 6 through 7, where Paul and his companions were blamed for an uprising / treasonous acts there in Thessalonica. Luke is trying to help us see here and show us the pattern of Paul and friends being treasonous is that they're actually not doing anything that is against Roman law. In Thessalonica and Ephesus, other places they have visited within the Roman province, they have stayed within the Roman law, which is not always, of course, the Jewish law, which, of course, is part of what we have an issue with here. This further shows that the Christian movement that Paul and others are leading also remain within Roman law. This new messianic movement, this new Christian movement, the way, whatever you wanted to call it at that time, was within Roman law as well. The unrest that Tertullus brings up is not always of Paul's doing. There had been known Jewish community unrest like in Alexandria, Egypt, and other places where Paul had not gone. Yet it is undeniable that in the cities where Paul had ventured, there was Jewish community unrest there, and that would be in Thessalonica, Ephesus, and Corinth. But that wasn't necessarily Paul as much as it was the community itself being unhealthy and in bad places. Now, of course, Paul said things that upset them, but they were already in bad shape before he even got there, which is one reason he goes. Paul had nothing to do with the political uprisings that were happening with Jewish communities during this time. This again eventually leading to that war I was talking about earlier on that begins in, referred to as the Roman War, which begins in AD 66. Some were trying to confuse what Paul was doing with the fight for Judean independence, which Paul absolutely had nothing to do with and did not want to do, but that is what is happening partially here. Some even using a messianic focus, which actually did eventually happen with the breakup of the Jewish church and the Gentile church, but that wasn't until about AD 132. So Tertullus here was trying to make Felix believe that Paul was one of the agitators trying to cause discourse in that empire, when in fact that was not Paul's goal at all. This is probably why Lysias back there in Jerusalem was so quickly trying to flog Paul, thinking he was an agitator, thinking he was not who he said he was, and that he was, or pretty much projecting who he thought he was as an agitator on him, thus wanting to flog him to get him, so the peace would remain there in Jerusalem. Verse 5. The reference to the Nazarenes is an attempt to make the group that Paul was leading seem like a rebellious group within the Jewish community, because nothing good can come out of Nazareth, as we know. And so they're bringing that up. The Sadducees and the Pharisees were known, like I said, were known as sects. The Nazarenes here, as they're trying to refer to them as a Nazarene sect, now is as well, but of course not the good kind. We can think of the Nazarenes, according to the priest, as still Jewish. According to the Jews, this is what they think. They're still Jewish, but they're subversive and heretical. They're Jews with a twinge of rebellion, going against the views of the true Jewish traditions. As a point of note here, this is the only time that Nazarene is used to point to a group of followers of Jesus. Other times, it is, of course, used as a direct reference to Jesus, but this is the only time to a group. With that said, to this day, Jewish Christians are still referred to as Nazarenes or Nazaroeans, is in Hebrew and Arabic. I didn't want to say Aramaic, but Arabic. And at this time, it is a positive name, but during that time, they were hoping that Nazarene would have a negative effect, hurting Paul's cause. In verse 6, the profaning of the temple that we see here in verse 6 is by far the most serious of accusations against Paul. It does not seem to be the same argument as we saw earlier when Paul was first attacked after people witnessing that he took a Gentile into the inner courts. Unfortunately for the Sanhedrin, the eyewitnesses that they claimed saw Paul do this never showed up. it could not be found, and so no real case could ever be made against Paul for this. Since no case could be made, the argument was changed a bit, stating that the temple police had prevented Paul from entering the courts. They're heroes. Heroes they are. He was painting the temple police as the guys who would save the day from such a vile man as this, who would come in and desecrate the Jewish temple. Though it is not called out, Tertullus attempts to score a point against Lysias by changing the changed truth a bit more. Remember, Lysias, when he sent that letter to Felix, kind of changed he did change the rules a bit, or I guess the story a bit, and now Tertullus is trying to turn it on Lysias a bit here. The point being, and everyone understanding, that it is not within the Romans' rule to interfere with such a matter in the temple, and that possibly Lysias had overstepped his boundary by what he did, and we know he did, but not because of the temple, but because of him wanting to flog and actually attempting to flog a Roman citizen that had not gone through a fair trial. Going back to Tertullus, what he's providing ultimately is a weak argument based on the Romans could do whatever they wanted to keep the peace, even though there was an agreement between the Romans and the Jews for the Jews to take care of their own business within the temple. So the Jews are overstepping their bounds significantly here again. Continue on here, verses 7 through 9. Depending on your translation, you may notice that there is not a verse 7 here. In the Western text, which is not a different, but probably an older version of a lot of the text that is translated, there is. You could probably also see that in King James Version actually has this. Some translations add it possibly with brackets, so depending on what you have, could have that. Some people have accepted this as a genuine based on the rest of the speech, while others have obviously not. So take verse 7 and even part of 8. Actually, it's the end of 6 going into the first part of 8, as you will. It could have been added. There is evidence, textual evidence that it does exist, but others would say maybe it was added later on. For those of you following along and recalling the events from chapter 21, you would note that there was no attempted peaceful or fair trial for Paul from the Jewish people. They were ready to hang him. There's nothing of any sort of peace. They were not going to set him before a trial. It was truly, let's get this guy and let's kill him. Similar to what Paul used to do to the early Jewish Christians long ago, probably 20-ish, at this point, over 20 years ago. So the argument that they're going to be fair trial according to the Jewish law, of course, is a lie. If this version is accepted that we see here, again, depending on your translation, here in the Net Bible, it is fully in here. But I believe in the NASB, it's in brackets. If this is true, then by questioning him is most likely not about questioning Paul, but questioning Lysias. Lysias will have his say later on in this chapter, but we'll get to there when we get there. Tertullus' speech does not end in the same sort of grandeur in which it started. It almost kind of piddles out and just kind of fades away. Again, remember Luke is summarizing this information, so he may be taking some of the bravado out at the end just because he likes to kind of write to his and Paul's benefit. He's done that before and will continue to do it. And how his style is, and writers have the ability to do that. There's no reason why they can't. They're trying to tell a story, and that's what Luke is doing here. Either way, it seems like based on what they say here, where the Jews joined in there in verse 9, they were happy with what Tertullus had to say and were ready for Paul to be, killed for what he did, or fully convicted. Verses 10 through 21. That's a lot to read. Okay, let's we'll get here to the defense. Paul will now give his defense to Felix, which pretty much again seems to be a summary written by Luke, much like what we got from Tertullus. This is only the second time Paul has gone before a Roman tribune. Actually, I don't think it's Roman tribune, but a Roman governor. The last was in Corinth before Gallio, but actually that case was dismissed before actually Paul was even able to speak. So let's read verses 10 through 21. When the governor had nodded for him to speak, Paul responded, "Knowing that for many years you have been a judge to this nation, I cheerfully make my defense. since you can take note of the fact that no more than 12 days ago I went up to Jerusalem to worship. Neither in the temple, nor in the synagogues, nor in the city itself did they find me carrying on a discussion with anyone or causing a riot. Nor can they prove to you the charges of which they now accuse me. But this I admit to you, that according to the way which they call a sect, I do serve the God of our fathers, believing everything that is in accordance with the law and that is written in the prophets, having a hope in God, which these men cherish themselves, that there shall certainly be a resurrection of both the righteous and the wicked. It's amazing what Paul is doing here. He is, for the most part, telling the Jewish story and how the Jewish story is going to end, or has already come to this conclusion. Yet the Sadducees and the Pharisees will not fully admit to it. Sadducees certainly will not fully admit to it. In view of this, Paul has done this before. Verse 16, I also do my best to maintain always a blameless conscience both before God and before men. This is something that Paul repeats multiple times whenever he does a defense in front of either Jews or Romans. And after several years, I came to bring alms to my nation and to present offerings, in which they found me occupied in the temple, having been purified without any crowd or uproar. But there were some Jews from Asia. I think they would say those were from probably Ephesus, most likely, who ought to have been present before you to make this accusation if they should have anything against me. Or else let these men themselves tell what misdeed they found when I stood before the council. Other than for this one statement, which I shouted out while standing among them, for the resurrection of the dead, I am on trial before you today. So that was a very controversial thing related to the resurrection of the dead, because remember, the Sadducees did not believe in resurrection. And so that Paul would announce this so loudly and so boldly, of course, would make the Sadducees quite upset. All right, let's run through things. Paul gives, like I said, a quick introduction, again, complimenting Felix. He knows how this works. He's seen it done before. He knows that the compliment will work and how this is all going to play out. He has a similar sort of, formula that you would typically see whenever you go before a governor or a tribune there in Rome. He makes everyone aware that he is aware that Felix had been over Judea for a reasonable amount of time, and to know about the province. This would mean he would know the ways of the Jews and their laws and could assess them fairly, which is something that the guy who's going to follow him, Festus, does not know. And so this would be to Paul's advantage, that Felix is very familiar with the Jewish ways and the Jewish traditions. Paul, I believe Paul was probably hoping that Felix would see it this way and would just kind of let him go on, but we'll see. That did not happen. Paul makes it clear there in verses 11 through 13 that he has been away for a while, about 5 years, but he has returned with tithes and offerings to the Jerusalem church. He brings that up again there in verse 17. He's reflecting on the past chapters and his quick trip down to the coast. He had returned to join the others for the festival of Pentecost, if you guys remember from the past several chapters where they made the quick trip down from Greece and that region down the coast, and eventually we're trying to get Jerusalem in time for Pentecost, which I believe he does. He had only been in Jerusalem for 12 days, and 3 of those days he was in the Antonia fortress. Not a lot of time to make trouble. And I've seen some commentators say, well, he was in the fortress for 3 days, and he's been in Caesarea now for 5 days, so he's really only in Jerusalem in the free for about 4. So, Before being taken into the fortress, he had done nothing to cause any disruption or provoked a riotous assembly, according to Paul. Though he could have, he did not engage in public debate. He could have easily done what he liked to do and go into synagogues and other public areas and debate the scriptures with others. He did not, but instead he did not draw any attention to himself or attempt to embarrass any of the Jewish leaders. In verses 14 through 16, Paul is very clear about what he did while in Jerusalem. He worshipped the ancestral God of Israel. He had worshipped the way or the belief of the resurrected Messiah, which is a basic tenet of Jewish belief. What he was doing was what Israel had been hoping for generations. It was the hope of Israel for the resurrection of the Messiah, and that's exactly what has happened, and that is what Paul is worshiping, and that's the sect, as they say it, that Paul is leading. he's doing what it said was going to happen. And as you saw here, all that is laid down by the law or written in the prophets, he is now living. And if they wanted to, they could live in that world as well. As you remember, though, the Sadducees did not believe in resurrection of the Messiah. The Pharisees did. And so it was the hope of all Israel that this would happen. Note that this is the only time in the New Testament where Paul unambiguously credited with believing in a resurrection for both the righteous and the unrighteous dead, which is not anything we're going to talk about today, but is just an interesting thing to point out here. Of course, this is tied to to his Pharisee background and beliefs. They had believed in a twofold resurrection. When he creates his doctrine in the epistles, he writes, he does not have a twofold focus there in the epistles. So if you went back and read the epistles, you typically get the dead, the righteous of the dead, or the dead righteous. He doesn't really bring up the unrighteous dead. And the reason he does that is that the understanding to focus on the hope of those set before Christ, those who are righteous before Christ, to give them hope there. With all that said, it's Paul's intent now and before to maintain a clear conscience before God and humans alike. Verse 17 here, we talk about the alms. After being gone for about 5 years, he has returned to bring alms and offerings to his fellow Jews. This is most likely the clearest reference of Paul organizing churches on his Gentile mission. So the Gentile churches are giving relief to the Jewish Christians of Jerusalem, which is funny that this is all playing out this way. Or even some could even take it as far as that he was bringing money back or offerings back for the temple as well. So it's more than just the Jews in Jerusalem who we know needed help because of the financial situation they were in based on becoming Messianic Jews, but also to bring it back to the temple because that is a continuation of the Jewish faith. There is a reference earlier from the Jerusalem leaders. As you remember, Paul and Barnabas were to support the poor, and that's exactly what Paul is doing here. Paul here makes it clear that the funds brought are twofold, to give to the poor among the saints of Jerusalem, as well as to thanksgiving offering to God. Of course, that would be the offering there in the temple. The idea or hope that Paul had would be the unification of the Gentile and Jerusalem church, which didn't work exactly as Paul had wanted it to. The Gentiles were giving a thanksgiving offering to the Jerusalem church because this is where the gospel started and had originated from, and for that they are grateful. So that is why the Gentiles would be willing to give an offering to the Jerusalem church. The other side of it is that the Jerusalem church, who are, like we know, were mostly poor, would become less skeptical of the Gentiles through the gift that was being provided to them, to know that the Gentiles were on their page. They were on their team. They were talking about the same God and the same Messiah. This hope, of course, was partially realized. There would continue to be a divide between the Jerusalem and the Gentile church, seemingly held by the Jerusalem church and their view of the Gentiles. It seemed like it was more of an issue with the Jews or the Jerusalem church than it was with the Gentiles, and that's just kind of how it played out. Verses 18 and 19. Recall when Paul came to Jerusalem, he was asked to go through a purification process in the temple with those, I believe it was 4 other guys. And based on the amount of time he had spent with the Gentiles and all the impurities that he had done whilst with the Gentiles. And this was also done to help the Jerusalem church that see that he was still Jewish. He was still following Jewish traditions and rituals, and that he is not the evil Gentile guy that they're making him out to be. He had done nothing to cause a riot or raise the ire of the Jerusalem leaders. It seems some of his old friends from the Asia province had come down to cause some trouble and agitate the Jews in Jerusalem, which they did very well. Not like it was already quite a tinderbox in the first place, and now they just kind of put a little bit more paper on that fire and allowed it to take off. Paul believes those are the folks who need to have shown up before Felix, those who accused him from the Asia province, as they're the ones who had the issue with Paul. Them not being there, of course, shows that they really didn't have anything, and obviously they don't care that much because they don't even show up to even say anything. And they knew, for the most part, and the Sanhedrin would probably slightly believed or slightly relieved that the Asian Jews did not stand up either, because they knew that during cross-examination, their case would look weak and shallow and not be able to be held up in court. And so that is not that. So it may be good for the Sanhedrin that these guys didn't show up either, because you have to think about it. If the Roman governor was already kind of someone who had a happy trigger finger, it wouldn't take much more to be upset with a bunch of Jews who were lying to him and wasting his time. So take it as you will. Since the Asian Jews did not show up, this is verses 20 and 21. Let the Sanhedrin present the explicit concerns that they have with Paul to be a bit less vague than Tertullus was, is what Paul is asking for. The only crime they could possibly have said he caused was the claim of resurrection of the dead, and that, my friends, is no crime. Now, they may make people upset, but it's not a crime. All right, let's wrap up chapter 24, verses 22 through 27. But Felix, having a more exact knowledge about the way, put them off, saying, "When Lysias the commander comes down, I will decide your case." Then he gave orders to the centurion for him to be kept in custody and yet have some freedom, and not to prevent any of his friends from ministering to him. But some days later, Felix arrived with Drusilla, his wife, who was a Jewess, and sent for Paul and heard him speak about the faith in Christ Jesus. But as he was discussing righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come, Felix came frightened and said, "Go away from the present, and when I find time, I will summon you." At the same time, too, he was hoping that money would be given him by Paul. Therefore, he also used to send for him quite often and converse with him. But after 2 years had passed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus and was given to the Jews a favor. Felix left Paul, and wishing to do the Jews a favor, Felix left Paul imprisoned. Nice guy. So, never really had Paul in his best interest here, now did he? So, as we move through this and we wrap up chapter 24, we'll continue to see how this is going to play out. Felix finds all these Jewish priests who had traveled up, or actually down from Jerusalem to Caesarea, that 60-mile track, to be quite annoying. And so he adjourns the proceedings. And as we go into verse 22, we're not sure why Felix already had a good understanding of the way. Could have been through his Jewish wife, Drusilla, who is a member of the Herod family. It can be assumed he already knew who was telling the truth, so he adjourns the proceedings, most likely with a statement of judgment reserved, as in he knows what he's going to say, he's just not ready to say it. Lysias seems to be the one who will make the final decision based on his letter. This is even more important since Paul and Tertullus' stories were so dissimilar. So, we really don't know what's going on in Felix's head. We can guess. We can think that maybe I would guess, based on what I've read, is that he did not want to upset the Jews, which would make sense, because though Paul was powerful and had a lot of influence, the Jews were the ones who were making the big waves and could really blow things up pretty quick for him, and he could lose his power. Verse 23, Paul remains under a type of arrest that was typical of a non-accused Roman citizen, where he'd have freedom to see his friends and acquaintances. He'd have the freedom to be fed, and he'd have the freedom to not necessarily leave by any stretch, but maybe he could leave with a guard. But anyways, he was taken care of because he had not been convicted of any sort of crime. Most likely, some would say there was a group that came with him up down from Jerusalem to Caesarea, and they would and could help. Caesarea at the time also had a Christian population that was probably very familiar with what was going on with Paul and would be there to support Paul as well. So he wasn't there by himself. Though it was not a great experience, it was not the worst experience that he could have been in. He's been in a lot worse positions in the past. We are not 100% sure if Lysias ever made his way down to Caesarea. We can assume he did and provide additional information, most likely clearing Paul of all the charges, but again, Felix never really does anything with that. Most likely, Paul was not released because Felix did not want to offend the Sanhedrin. He had already beat up on them and did not need to stir the pot. His brother Pallas according to the historian Tacitus, anyways, no longer had the influence that he had in the past. I believe we talked about Pallas a little bit last time. And so Pallas no longer has the same sort of influence with the emperor. It seems that Nero was not as fond of him as Claudius was, and so he was kicked out of the inner circle, and this probably happened around AD 55. Now, that's not the last we hear of him, of Pallas, but that's kind of what we know about him at this point. Paul will meet again there. We're verses 24 through 26 with Felix, along with his Jewish wife Drusilla. It seems that Felix wanted to take advantage of having someone like Paul in his custody and wanted to question Paul in order to learn more about the way. And some would say probably wanted to question Paul because he wanted to see if Paul could get him some of that money he got from the Gentile churches. Drusilla was the youngest daughter of Herod Agrippa I, and probably at this time was a teenager. At an early age, she was betrothed to the crown prince of Commagene in Eastern Asia Minor, but it fell through because he did not want to become a Jewish proselyte, which that could cause some problems. Her brother Agrippa II then tried to give her away to the king of Emesa, which is a small kind of petty state there in Syria, in the region of Syria. But when she was about 16, Felix, with the help of a Cypriot magician called Edemas, persuaded her to leave her husband and become his wife, promising her intense happiness, felicity, much like his name Felix, if she did so. She does do this. She does fall into the trap and becomes Felix's third wife and bears a son she names Agrippa, who died in an eruption of the volcano Mount Vesuvius around AD 79. So, anyways, interesting little backstory there of our Jewish friend who has joined Felix there for some of these meetings with Paul. So anyways, verse 25, the two royals listened to Paul explain the Christian faith, but made it clear the gospel had ethical implications that Felix did not seem comfortable with, nor did his wife seem very comfortable with. It seems Paul was quite clear and pointed in his discussion with the two, something they would not have been accustomed to. And then based on Paul's focus of righteousness, self-control, and future judgment, they decided that they had enough because, hey, this guy's really kind of telling us stuff we don't want to know. And let's just send him off. But again, as you see here, Felix will bring this guy back multiple times. We believe mainly for, hopefully for some sort of financial benefit. So this alternative motive, there are multiple edicts there in Roman law against bribery, but the wheels of Roman justice turned very well when it came to these well-oiled machines that were oiled by cash. And so it was something that happened, though it wasn't supposed to happen. So away we go. It seems as Felix's hope, of course, here where Paul would want to bribe Felix so that Felix would release him. But unfortunately for him, for Felix, he was quite disappointed because Paul was not going to be the guy who would bribe him. Maybe he never acts. Verse 27, 2 years in Caesarea under arrest must have been a tedious time for a man like Paul. That's understanding how long he was there. At the end of those 2 years, Felix is replaced by Festus, most likely because of some civil strife between the Jews and Gentile inhabitants of Caesarea. It seems that Felix intervened in a way that caused significant amounts of bloodshed among the leaders of the Jewish faction. Felix would have been punished severely on his way back to Rome, but Pallas, we hear this is his brother that we talked about just a second ago, greased the wheels of the system. Though he's no longer in official power, he had a significant amount of wealth that he used to persuade those who wanted to punish Felix not to do so, or at least not to do as badly. We now get introduced to Porcius Festus. He had a brief and troubled administration, which he was there from about AD 59 to AD 62 when he died. Although it seems he did not lead the same life of excess as his predecessors, he was probably a pretty nice guy. Well, not nice, but at least he wasn't as stuck on wealth and greed as it seems the others were. This change of governors was of no advantage to Paul as he remained in custody. It was believed that Felix did this as a goodwill gesture to the Jews. Festus, being less experienced in the way, was to Paul's disadvantage. But that plan did not work out for the Jews either, and we'll learn that as we go into the first part of chapter 25 here, chapter 25, verses 1 through 12. Just for kicks and grins, I'm going to read all the way through from 25, 1 through 12, and then we will discuss it, where Festus is going to here take a trip on down to Jerusalem, which these guys didn't really like to do because Jerusalem wasn't as nice as Caesarea, as it didn't have the coast and the beach. And it seems like they would they would spend a significant amount of time on the coast there in Caesarea and only go up to Jerusalem when issues arose that they needed to address directly. Verse 25, chapter 25, verse 1, Festus then, having arrived in the province 3 days later, went up to Jerusalem from Caesarea, and the chief priest and leading men of the Jews brought charges against Paul, and they were urging him, requesting a concession against Paul that he might have him brought to Jerusalem, at the same time setting an ambush to kill him on the way. These guys still haven't learned that when you're being guarded by Roman soldiers, it's not going to go well for you. Anyways, Festus then answered that Paul was being kept in custody at Caesarea and that he himself was about to leave shortly. Therefore, he said, let the influential men among you go there with me, and if there's anything wrong about the man, let them prosecute him. After he had spent not more than 8 or 10 days among them, he went down to Caesarea, and on the next day he took his seat on the tribunal and ordered Paul to be brought. After Paul arrived, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him, bringing many and serious charges against him, which they could not prove. While Paul said, in his own defense, I have committed no offense either against the law of the Jews or against the temple or against Caesar. But Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, answered Paul and said, are you willing to go to Jerusalem and stand trial before me on these charges? But Paul said, this is great what Paul does. Paul's very wise. I am standing here before Caesar's tribunal, where I ought to be tried. I have done no wrong to the Jews, as you very well know. If then I am a wrongdoer and have committed anything worthy of death, I do not refuse to die. But if none of these things is true, of which these men accuse me, no one can hand me over to them. I appeal to Caesar. That is huge. You should have some sort of music there at that point. Then when Festus had conferred with his council, he answered, you have appealed to Caesar you shall go. Pretty dramatic thing of events. Poor Festus was probably extremely relieved that he did not have to deal with this guy anymore, because this guy appealed to Caesar. When you appeal to Caesar, away you go. You don't get to hang out anymore there. You get to head to Rome, and at that time visit Nero, which I guess Paul seemed to think could be in his favor. Anyways, verses 1 through 3 of chapter 25. It was smart of Festus to go to the Jewish leadership in Jerusalem as soon as possible to help make up for the bad blood between them and the previous procurator Felix. They wanted Paul to be brought back to Jerusalem so they could, of course, attempt to kill him. It's been 2 years since they made that vow. If you remember that vow, that they were going to kill him on his way to Caesarea. Before he got to Caesarea, they made the vow not to taste or not to eat or drink anything. So these guys were either very hungry, they were either dead, or they had kind of figured out a way to give up the vow, or it was a different group that kind of heard about it and they were ready to go after him. Anyways, so there is hope for them because Festus is quite naive and he could ship Paul back to Jerusalem and they'd be able to kill Paul on the way back. It's not determined if this was the original, like I said, if this was the original 40 who had made the vow or not, but it was somebody who had some sort of level of zeal that was willing to take out Paul and risk their own lives by going up against Roman soldiers. Verses 4 through 5, Festus, of course, does not fall for their wicked ways and instead invited them to join him back in Caesarea. Seems we are in another pattern of where the Jews get to take another trip down to Caesarea. I'm not sure if it took 5 days or what it took this time, but they go make their way back and, well, have their argument against Paul. Anyways, verses 6 through 12, we'll see by the end of these that Paul will finally get his chance to appeal to Caesar. We start the whole case against Paul anew. How many times has this happened over how many years? It's just crazy that he continues to have these same accusations against him. Much like when Felix had invited the Sanhedrin down to meet with him in Caesarea, now Festus does the same thing. Felix had failed Paul, and Festus attempts to do the same, but we see that Paul will not allow, as a Roman citizen, for that to happen. Again, the Sanhedrin could produce no evidence of anything wrong that Paul had done, though their accusations were quite grand and robust. Some would say they grabbed Tertullus' script and ran through it again, this time with a different audience. Again, with no witnesses or hard evidence, all Paul had to do was deny the charges, especially the one regarding the sanctity of the temple, because the witnesses who said they saw it were not there. There's no evidence. And again, like I said, that would be the only way, even under Roman law, that Paul could be punished. When the aged Jews and Paul did not what the aged Jews said Paul did had no weight, as it was outside of the jurisdiction of the Sanhedrin, since he was in Gentile country. So when they said, the aged Jews said, oh, he was out and about doing all these things in Ephesus and other parts of the region, well, that's well beyond the purview of the Jewish leaders, and so they can't even do anything about it in the first place. So even if they brought that up, the Roman governor is like, well, okay, nothing we can do about that. There's no evidence, and it's outside of your jurisdiction. Either way, he did not break any Jewish laws in the Gentile lands, nor in Jerusalem. Regarding the charge of acting against the emperor's interest, this was well outside, again, the Sanhedrin's jurisdiction, which opened up a window for Paul to appeal only to Caesar. He does not have to go to Jerusalem because he did nothing wrong in Jerusalem, as this was a matter only Caesar could deal with at this time. Again, like with Lysias and Felix, only confusion is brought before Festus, so no decision could be made. Festus offers what seems to be a reasonable proposal while the trial takes place in Jerusalem, with him as the judge. I mean, hey, I'm still the Roman guy. I can still preside over this, but Paul knows better. Though the Jews brought up issues regarding Jewish law as a Roman citizen, Paul was still allowed a Roman trial, which he should be, and he would get one in front of the governor, Festus, but Paul knows better that Festus is probably just trying to appease the Jewish leaders, and Paul's not allowing for it. He was thinking maybe that this Festus guy is going to bend for the Jewish leaders now, and who knows what he'll do next time, or who knows how bad this could get for me. So let's not do that. He's going to appeal to Caesar. Paul knew go back to Jerusalem would put him in trouble all over again. He also knew this concession was going to go very badly. Festus was a novice in this arena, and it would be likely the Jewish leaders would exploit him, making it really hard on Paul. Paul knew only his safe path was to Caesar. His only other option was to go to Jerusalem and get beat up by the Jewish people and possibly killed. So which option would you pick? Paul makes it very clear that if he broke a law, he's willing to take the consequences of it. It's not like he's saying, I'm going to run from every law and everything that you guys are saying about me. He's like, I would do it. Just you let me know. But he knows this is part of an unfair process. And since he is under the tribunal of Festus, it automatically puts him underneath the authority of Caesar. So there's really nothing the Jews could have done anyways besides somehow kill him in a very unfair, uncivil way. An appeal, something considered to be normal that he does, is something that would be normal since about 509 BC in the Roman Empire. It was something that Roman citizens were allowed to appeal to the emperor when wanting an appeal against a magistrate's verdict. So if they didn't like the verdict, they could appeal to Caesar, and this is something that was allowed by Roman citizens. And it would, for the most part, keep them from undue coercion or punishment from those who were in provincial power. It was not for the same for those who are not citizens. So those who lived there in the Roman province but were not citizens, they did not have the same sort of level of protection. It's kind of curious why Paul did not appeal when Felix was in charge, but it seems it was because Felix had for the most part said that there was no case and was just holding on to discharge Paul. So Paul had waited all that time because he's thinking, hey, this guy he's on my side. He's going to choose my side, but it doesn't happen. And so that could be why Paul does not appeal at that point. Maybe it is that he would be discharged sooner rather than later, but it didn't work for him. As we go into verse, let's see here. Just whenever we see the appeal to Caesar, that is just the title of the emperor at the time. Nero was the emperor at the time. of Rome, and still had a good track record at this point, and was still relatively friendly to Roman Christians up to this point, which is around AD 59. It wasn't until about 64, AD 64, 65, things that changed dramatically. Nero was, we can say, not as nice to the Roman Christians as he was in the past. So he kind of eventually turned against the Christians. But at this time, there was still hope for those who claimed to be a Christian. Wrapping this up, verse 12, Festus was quite relieved by Paul's words. At this time, he was able to pass off his responsibility to the emperor there in Rome. He confers there with his own council to make a decision, but in all reality, there was no decision to be made. Once a Roman citizen appeals, the wheels start moving and start moving that person towards that trial. Huge win for Paul, as you can imagine. It gets him a free trip to Rome, all expenses paid, where he'll get an impartial trial, but it'll also help him legitimize the Gentile churches, a legal status referred to as collegium licetum, for those of you who are following along in Latin. And this would separate their status, of course, from the Jews. So that's one hope that Paul had, is that he could separate them from these zealous Jews and let them kind of have their own sort of classification, but in a good way. Also, as Paul would always like, it gives him a chance to even evangelize in the seat of power, in the seat of Roman power. So this is a huge, huge thing for Paul to be able to do this. All right, and there we go. So there we are, end of chapter 25, verse 12. Next week we'll start 13 of chapter 25 and run into chapter 26. Paul's defending himself before Agrippa as we get there into chapter 26. Probably run that through verse 8-ish, maybe verse 12, depending on what's going on. Oh man, we're so close. So close, you can just almost feel it. Wow, chapter 27 is really long. Anyways, hope you have a great day, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, bye.